John, an absolute tragic start to this broadcast today. I couldn't find the buttons or anything. But this is the Daily Wrestling News Show where we are here to teach, learn, and remember the history of professional wrestling with everyone that wants to join us. It is a special, our third special, covering Tales from the Territories. I'm here with John DeConnie. John, how are you?
Good. Beautiful morning so far here in Jersey. How
Oh,
are things on the Treasure Coast?
I think the high is only going to be 70 today, so it's going to be a little on the chilly side. Yeah.
I get things like that from my parents who now live out in San Diego. It just makes me want to say,
Yeah.
"Oh, only 70. Okay."
Yeah. It was fine. It's fine. So Tales from the Territory continued last night. We had episode number 3, AWA. What's it called? Wrestling from the Heartland.
And body slams in the heartland.
Body slams in the Heartland. I wrote it down, but didn't transcribe it. So, the crew that they had assembled was Diamond Dallas Page, Medusa, Jim Brunzell, Greg Gagne,
Ken Patera.
and Ken Patera. Right. This one was a little different. I had heard some of the stories, so that was not new, and some of it was, a lot of it actually, I don't even believe. I have to say, which is funny because we heard some wild stuff in the last 2 episodes about Memphis, but some of this stuff I don't even buy it. So I'll be interested to get your take on some of it.
Yeah, some of it just feels like old lore and just come on, that didn't really happen.
Right. So AWA, it was started by Olympian, 1948 Olympian Vern Gagne. The company was sort of sports based. Vern liked to play it straight, they said, as opposed to the flashy, flamboyant characters that we saw in the Northeast. But John, did you have any exposure to AWA?
No, I just, I know that the Minnesota territory, if you will, is a lot of big names came out of there. I know it's one of the ones that, as they get into, Vince really did dirty when he took over and went national and took a lot of talent from. But I, I certainly never watched it, and
Yeah.
I and even quite frankly, with one exception that we'll get into, I'm sure, later in the show, I don't know that I've really seen all that much footage from it ever.
Mm,
Yeah,
okay.
we see little clips here and there of a lot of territory stuff because you're telling the history of wrestling. The WWE is still telling the history of wrestling, and you get old clips every now and then, but not a lot from the AWA that comes to my mind.
Yeah, the territory would go north to Winnipeg, south to Chicago, and west to California. I also noticed the Denver was in there too. So
Yeah,
I
Denver
don't know
was
if
a
you want to.
big center, yeah, for
I don't know if
them.
you want to call that south or west, but it's
A little of both.
yeah. But I seem to recall when I was reading some of the Jericho autobiographies that he would reference NWA as making it up there and stuff like that, and that would make sense to me, especially with Don Callis and Kenny Omega both being from that area as well,
Yeah,
and the Heenan Bockwinkel stuff being sort of the formula that they used for their presentation over the
yeah,
last couple of years. So makes sense to me that it would have been something that Jericho would have also seen up in Winnipeg.
absolutely.
Jim Brunzell kind of starts things off by saying he's kind of happy to be alive because most of his contemporaries are not with us anymore.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, and especially from that era, and like from that era, and just a little bit forward. We've thankfully not had too many recently, but we had a 10-year period where guys were dropping like flies in their 40s and stuff, and
Yeah.
it was got to be heartbreaking for us as fans. Imagine the guys who lived and went up and down the roads with them.
Yeah, you're right. Most of the ones that we've had lately are, Antonio Inoki just passed away, but he was in his 70s, which, he had a good life. I'm wearing my Luna Vachon shirt. I didn't have
Nice.
anything AWA specific, but since they talked a lot about Mad Dog Vachon, I thought I would at
Yes.
least wear the Luna shirt.
Oof.
What was the story that stuck out most to you?
The one that made me smile is one that, and again, it was kind of quick in their sit down, and likewise, it was very quick because there's not a lot of details to it to be had. But uh, as things go along, I keep forgetting that I've written some things and recorded some things with you 3 months ago, 4 months ago, and I'm like, oh, that that Bobby Heenan story is in my Bobby Heenan episode of the gunshot, and again, it's just in mine, it's just two sentences. Someone fired a gun towards ringside from a few rows back, and someone was trying to murder Bobby. He was such a heat magnet. Someone brought a gun to a Chicago show and had the thought in mind of murdering a professional wrestling manager live in the middle of a show.
They talked about how much heat he had in the territory. That was the one thing regarding Bobby Heenan is this guy was hated. And that incident that you're talking about, a woman was shot in the neck, a guy was shot in the shoulder because the bullets ricocheted off of the, I guess, the ring apron or whatever,
Sure.
and they never caught the guy.
That was the part that I didn't find in my research earlier. That like it just kind of like everywhere you saw it, it was just like, hey, a guy fired, I think, 3 shots, 5 people were hurt, none of which were Bobby Heenan, thank goodness. But again, 5 people were hurt. But yeah, and then he just walks out of the building.
It's bizarre. How does that happen, right? Like he was the guy holding the gun. If you
Yeah.
needed help in the the detective work there, I mean, come on. Um, so there were a couple of stories about the airplane that we'll get into at some point, but the big story, I think that I knew the story going in because it's one of legend,
Yeah.
but to hear Ken Patera tell his McDonald's story is ridiculous.
And to see everyone at the table not be bashful about not buying it.
Yeah, and the poor guy, I mean, he was a bit emotional about the whole thing. He was 78 years old as he's telling the story, and he's talking about, so they did a show. Masa Saito, he wrestled Mad Dog Vachon, hurt his leg, so they are in this remote town, and the only thing open is like the Holiday Inn bar. So they go, they sit down, they have a bunch of drinks, but then they realize they haven't eaten. So they point Patera in the direction of McDonald's, which is down the hill and a couple blocks away. And since Saito's knee is hurt, he goes alone to go get the McDonald's. This is like midnight. He gets to McDonald's, and the thing that should tip you off first, John, is he even says it in the story. He walked through the drive-through and pounded on the window.
And I thought that was going to be the issue, that they just went, go away, you're not in a car. Because I've had that happen to me, a football or baseball camp, and 12 guys go and they walk up to the drive-through just to be funny and pretend like they're in a car, and the people behind the counter go, walk inside, stupid. Just
Yeah. You're not endearing yourself to anybody when you do that. So yeah, I thought that might be the punchline, but he tells the whole story about how he offered to give them $5 for the hamburgers that were going for 35 cents at the time, per hamburger, by the way. And the guy's like, no, the stack of hamburgers that you see, we're using for a commercial, so I can't do it. And Ken, the way Ken tells the story is he's like, okay, and he was about to walk away. And as he's walking away, some kid appears and says, I hate that guy. And Ken's like, yeah, I kind of do too at the moment. And then, Ken, over Ken's shoulder and through the window flies this boulder that Ken says that the kid threw. And Ken's like, why did you do that? And apparently the guy had fired him recently. That's Ken's story. And it continues. They go back to Ken goes back to the hotel. The cops show up. Saito doesn't speak any English, so Ken deals with the cops. They ask Ken if he was Ken Patera, and if he threw this. Yes, he's Ken Patera. Did you throw the rock through the McDonald's window? No, I didn't. And immediately she maces him, and then she maces Saito, and then they call for apparently the cops have called for backup, and they've all got billy clubs. And Patera and Saito decide, well, rather than get hit in the head over, repeatedly by these billy clubs, we're just going to beat up the cops. So 16, 17 cops, whatever it is, they beat them all up. They stack them up until one of them pulls a gun.
Yeah.
And at that point, the story kind of concludes. Ken Patera goes to jail for 2 years, 6 years probation, says that he lost out on $700,000 to $800,000 in booking and attorney fees and things like that. So the best part comes, and it's the moment that we're all thinking, when Jim Brunzell says, "All due respect, Ken, we love you, I love you, but I'm pretty sure you're the guy who threw that boulder through the window."
That was the funniest part of it to me. Ken Patera, as he's telling the story, it was basically a rock flew by his head.
Yeah.
When everybody else talks about it, it's a 30-pound boulder that an
Yes.
18-year-old kid is not shot putting, but perhaps the world's strongest man could.
Who did shot put before he did strongman and weightlifting competition. I mean, Patera is a legit bodybuilder, strongman. He if anybody's equipped to do that in this remote town, by the way, right? Like, there happened to be another guy big enough, strong enough
That was
at the McDonald's at midnight.
That was the other interesting thing about the story. Ken Patera set it up, and he even busted Greg Gagne's balls a little bit. Like, there were no accommodations for us. Your father probably set this up. Basically calling his father chintz or cheap guy. Waukesha, Wisconsin, is a suburb of Milwaukee. It's like the Rosemont Horizon and Chicago proper. It's just on the outskirts. He made it sound like it was in the Canadian wilderness.
Yes, he did say wilderness.
I'm quite sure if they had, jumped in a car instead of the story was he walked down the street from the hotel, and all that was available was a Holiday Inn. Well, in those days, is a Holiday Inn, the Howard Johnson, the Holiday Inn, the Red Roof Inn, things like that. I think that a lot of wrestlers probably stayed in places like that.
Yeah.
And if you hadn't gone to the bar for 2 hours to make sure you got in your 6 glasses of scotch and water and decided to eat first, maybe you wouldn't have run up against this closed McDonald's. But again, he made it out to be that he was in, the absolute nowheresville. He was right outside of Milwaukee.
and again, he's 78 years old telling this story. He did do time for this, and he did time in the prime of his wrestling career. So he probably did miss out, not only when you factor those 2 years, but any momentum or heat that he had going during that time is completely gone by the time he comes back. So absolutely. I do feel bad for him in that respect. And he is on the verge of tears because nobody will believe him. And he says, all the things I did. I was in the Olympics. I did these strongman competitions. And all anybody wants to talk to me about is this McDonald's thing. And I'm thinking to myself, if I was interviewing you damn right I'd be asking you about that McDonald's thing. Nobody, frankly, sorry, Ken, but nobody gives a crap about the other stuff when you have this on your rap sheet.
Yeah. He's such a unique figure in that, like, he didn't have a very long run in the WWF in my memory, Like, I know he was the second ever Intercontinental Champion, but he holds that rare distinction of the first 22 Intercontinental Champions. There's only 3 that aren't in the Hall of Fame, and he's one of them. And his run was kind of unspectacular in my memory, but here he was legitimately the world's strongest man for a while there. He was an Olympian. He was a strong man. Yeah, there was clips of him last night throwing, not throwing the discus, not throwing a shot, but throwing tractor tires. And this man was a physical specimen back in the day. And,
bending a pipe around his neck,
squatting with small vehicles back when the vehicles were still made out of steel, just insane feats of strength. And, he lost 2 years in the prime of his career behind bars. And, just it's and he really, like you say, he really was getting choked up at the beginning of that story, talking about how this crappy story is in every interview, and for good reason. But you also can understand why it upsets him.
Yeah, of course, because he feels accomplished with the other stuff that he did. So,
and he certainly is.
Yes,
he did it at a time where he had face recognition. Some people would walk up to him with the bleach blonde hair. Aren't you Ken Patera?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you're a mountain of a man with bleach blonde hair. Yeah, the odds are, yeah, that is Ken Patera. But had he done that maybe 10 years later, his life would be completely different because there was just so much more attention paid.
Yeah. Pivoting off of the McDonald's story, they all talked about all of the different people there, talked about how they got into the business. And basically they all started with AWA. Everybody that we heard from. His story I thought was really interesting because here you have Vern Gagne, who is a 1948 Olympian. You've got Ken Patera, who is a specimen, but apparently is broke or whatever. So so Vern actually sponsors Patera for the Olympics and the strongman and everything like that. And then at some point, Patera's like, maybe I'd like to get into wrestling. And since you're already paying for me to live,
I might as well make you some money.
So that's how he got in. Greg Gagne obviously is Vern's son. He drove the truck. He did the referee. Everybody else, Medusa tried to make it out like, oh, you had it easy, and he's like, well, being the son of the promoter is never the easiest thing. I had to do things that you didn't do, like drive the truck and referee and such like that, and wrestle Greg in the living room when he's moved all or wrestle Vern in the living room. Yeah,
right.
Jim Brunzell was somebody that Greg knew from college football. Dallas Page, interestingly enough, and I've heard this story from Dallas many times, where he had a few matches early in his, when he was about the right age, and then he got injured and he went to the bar scene. And by the time he got ready to come back, he was 30 years old, and he's like, I'm too old to start now. And so he sends in a tape to manage. So.
But isn't that crazy to think that he was 31 years old and he thought he was over the hill then?
Yeah.
Like under the 2022 or 2021 Vince rules where, 27 was the cutoff. All right. You get where he's coming from because maybe that's the thought of the old days promoters. But there was a long area in between there where 31 was not old at all.
Generally speaking, I mean, up until very recently, you're not even making it on WWE's main roster until you're that age.
Yeah. When I think of the fact that certain guy of course, DDP, we found out when he finally broke into WCW was close to 40, if not in his 40s.
Yeah.
When Batista broke on the main roster, he was 39, I think. Like you certainly can tell by looking at him, but I remember reading that in an article or something like that when he was a fairly new face to me and going like, holy crap.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but to think DDP thought it was probably like he had been a wrestler, okay, albeit not necessarily a good one. He had gotten injured. He had gone and done other things, and he had that itch to get back into the business and thought like, I'll never break in as a wrestler. Let me shift and try and become a manager.
Yeah. The other story that they told that I had heard before, Medusa was talking about how Vern Gagne, he believed in people early and helped a lot of people start. And they talked about this barn that Vern had, and it would be, there's no heat or anything in it, but that's where he took people to train. Ken Patera went there and others. And Ken would talk about how, it's this ring in the middle of the barn and there's pigeons overhead and chickens, and there's chicken shit all over the ring apron and stuff. And then they quickly pivot to tell the story about Ric Flair training there and quitting.
Yeah.
Who couldn't handle it or whatever. And then Vern went to Ric Flair's house, smacked him across the face, and dragged him there. And it just strikes me because when we talk about Memphis, there was a point in the Memphis episode. I'm sorry, was it the Memphis? Where they talked about the plane ride? Or the plane crash?
Yeah.
Talk about that in Memphis?
When was that?
Anyway, Ric Flair was in the plane crash that, if he was sitting in a different seat, he would have been dead. right? John, you wrote an episode for the Daily Wrestling News Show.
Certainly did. No, October 1st, I think, 1975. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what episode number it is. I can look it up in a second. But yeah, so Ric Flair had that moment. Here's another moment where we almost didn't have Ric Flair, but apparently, the fact that Vern was insistent that he would not quit.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, but yeah, and then what they were doing in that crappy barn with the chicken poop all over the ring and the bales of hay, and Minnesota winters, it was unheated. They were working out 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, starting every day with a mile run. The ring was dirty, the ropes were too loose, and because everything was cold, everything hurt just that little bit more. It's amazing that that's what passed for, just to think today. You think of the Performance Center. I've never walked through it, but we've seen through backstage stuff and little bits of documentary footage of what it looks like. To think of the way we train our athletes now as
yeah,
opposed to the way they did back then, it is so night and day. It is amazing.
in my notes, I actually wrote that he had his little that it was a performance center.
Yeah, exactly.
The October 4th episode of the Daily Wrestling News Show, episode number 47, what 1975 event nearly changed wrestling forever? That was the Ric Flair plane crash, and it was Crockett, so it wouldn't have been involved in the Memphis. I'm not sure why I had that brain malfunction there. So yeah, I mean, those are the kind of stories, but then they had a couple of stories about the airplane. Vern needed a way to move wrestlers around quickly because the territory was so big. So he had this little tiny plane, this 12-passenger plane, but wrestler weight meant they could only put about 8 people on there. And they would fly around the territory, but the wrestlers called this plane Suicide One because it was small and it had to fly low and things like that. So Mad Dog Vachon, a bunch of stories about him. The one about Adrian Adonis, Greg Gagne didn't even want to say it on the show, and I would have a hard time repeating it here as well.
Yeah, it's surprising that it didn't get cut because it didn't really have a lot of value.
No. But the Mad Dog Vachon one is I was saying earlier, there's things I didn't believe. I don't know if I believe this story about Mad Dog Vachon throwing stuff out of the airplane. I mean, it might be just to me, it seems like it's a tall tale.
Yeah, I don't buy parts of everything that led up to it either. Because I mean, the way they broke it down, this was a man who would drink a pint of whiskey before going out and performing,
along with 2 uppers.
And on that night, apparently, he drank his pint of whiskey. Brunzell gave him 2 basically amphetamine pills, gave him speed.
Yeah.
What today would be essentially Adderall. Drank a ton of beers and cleaned out the locker room of beers when nobody was looking. Had a metric ton of wine at dinner with his girlfriend or his fiance's family or something like that. Another pint of whiskey afterwards. They tried to calm him down when they put him on Suicide One by giving him a Quaalude.
He also smoked a joint.
He smoked a joint to try and calm down as well. Like, his body would be so up and down. There's no way, his either brain wouldn't have exploded or his heart wouldn't have stopped.
Right.
And then after that, you feel free to take over with what they say actually happened on the plane.
Essentially, the plane moves in such a way that they think they've actually been struck by another plane. And the pilot tells them that the door is actually open and please go shut the door. And they turn around and they see Mad Dog Vachon hanging out the door. And then they're flying somewheres over Iowa, I guess. And he starts throwing empty bottles and wrestling gear and boots and everything out the window. So I just don't know if I totally buy it, but they have to do an emergency landing. The police are on the scene. They give the AWA 2 options. They say, we can arrest Mad Dog, or you can take him and you can deal with him. And Mad Dog's like, you better take me, and you better deal with me. So they hog tie him up and put him in the back of the plane, and they arrive at their destination, and they decide to just leave him there and let the pilot deal with it. So that's the end of the story.
Yeah, because he spends the whole plane ride back telling everyone who is sitting around him, "I'm going to kill you when I get out of this.
Yeah.
When I get
Yeah.
out of these restraints."
Yeah.
Interesting fella.
Yeah. Remind me never to get in a plane with anybody named Vashon, I guess.
I would have to concur.
Nor will I at any point be not carpooling. What's the word when you have a chain of cars going somewhere?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Convoy, if you will.
a convoy. Yeah, with Sherry Martel.
I thought there was going to be a so much better story
I know.
attached to Sherry Milkshake Martell.
Yeah. Well, especially since the way they set up the segment. They talk about say Medusa gets the call from AWA to come in, and she's like, "Oh my god, of course, this is the opportunity that I've needed." And then she finds out that she's going to be working with Sherry Martel, and the way that the segment kind of opened, they said, "Oh my god, it was the Nightmare," I think is what they called her. Well, then the only story that they told was that uh, they were driving the heel car was in the front, the baby face car was behind them. The baby faces were all smoking weed, and so the windows were up. So Medusa's in there, and she's getting a contact high or whatever. And then Sherry Martel loves Dairy Queen, so they stop at Dairy Queen. She buys a bunch of milkshakes, and then as they're driving down the road, she comes out the sunroof and throws the milkshakes at the babyface car, which then they can't see. But apparently they could see enough to know that that it was Doug Summers who had his butt sticking out the window as they drove by. Although also he was driving.
While driving the other car. Okay.
Another tall tale, right? Like, how is that even possible? But
Ass
then,
out the window or feet on the pedals. I don't see how you do both.
well, they did pass him, so I could see maybe the car was slowing down. But then the car spun out of control, went off the road, and the baby faces beat them to the town, I guess. Is the end of the story. But Medusa did say kind of the heartfelt moment of this whole Medusa segment was that with the $800 that she got in her first paycheck, she bought markers for the graves of her, I believe, her aunt and her grandmother.
Yes.
That was kind of the heartfelt moment. So the AWA, in general, there's some other stories on there. This one I think is the weakest of the three so far. Although it was kind of fun to hear the Ken Patera version of the McDonald's story. So
Sure.
I would, if you haven't watched any of them yet, I would recommend going back and watching one of the other two episodes as a priority. The Memphis ones and the Andy Kaufman one.
Yeah. If you're gonna, but at this point, watch them in order because the first two were very, very good. This one was certainly you're not going to be bored sitting through it, but it pales in comparison to the first two.
Yeah. Oh, I guess the end of the AWA should really be discussed before we get out of here. Vince McMahon is never the baby face in these documentaries, is he?
My God. Every news story I hear about him, he's a bigger scumbag than I already give him credit for being tippy top of the list, first ballot Hall of Fame scumbag. This story was just another one where I went like, seriously?
Vince Sr. gets a deal with HBO, and all the territories are calling Vince Sr. saying, "What are you doing? You're overexposing. You're going to run into our territories. It's going to be a problem." And he's like, "Hey, no problem. Just send me some tapes with your top matches. We'll put them on HBO." It's Vince Jr.'s idea. So they do that, and then that's just Vince Jr.'s way of scouting all the talent and exposing it all over the country, which was good for his plans. And then Junior goes by the AWA, says, "I'd like to buy you out." And Vern says, "I got partners I got to talk it over with. So thank you for the number. I'll come back with another one." Vince says, "Yeah, give me a number." So Vern comes back with a number, and Vince is all irritated about it and says, "I don't negotiate." And he doesn't negotiate. He just runs you over. Hulk Hogan is scheduled for an AWA Christmas show, and he doesn't show up. And it sounds like Hogan was trying to give them the heads up and tried to give notice, but Vern kind of thought it was a rib from the Florida territory.
Yeah,
So
apparently he sent a handwritten note saying,
yeah,
"I'm not coming back.
Hulk.
Sorry."
So Hogan doesn't show up, and they get in contact with him. He's like, Vince Jr. He's paying me more money to stay home, so I've got to deal with him. And Greg Gagne tells the story that in that day there weren't any contracts, and they were just handshakes. But nobody ever broke their word on those for a long, long time. He said, I know nobody did it from 1950 till Hulk Hogan did it. And so Hogan was the guy who broke that. So if I'm looking at silver lining for that story, though, at least they all got contracts now.
Yeah, I suppose.
And Medusa asked Greg, so when did Vern realize, this was happening? And Greg said he never did, and he wouldn't quit.
Yeah.
So the legacy of the AWA was that for the long time, it was the biggest territory. It was started by Vern. Medusa would say that Vern was great at getting people started, and he really believed in them. Ken Patera would agree with that as well. So, like I said, interesting episode. Not as good as the Memphis one.
I think that is about the perfect encapsulation of it.
Yeah. Next week, Championship Wrestling from Florida. So we have, I know Jerry Briscoe's on there. I know Kevin Sullivan's on there. I believe Skinner is in there as well, but I don't know.
Yeah, there were two other faces that I'm looking at him and going, I really should know who that is. But like you say, Briscoe and Sullivan were the only ones that immediately I was like, oh, obviously I know who that is.
So we'll be right back here next week to cover those ones. John, anything else about the AWA that you want to chat about before we get out of here?
Just that the one thing that stuck out to me was that apparently that's where the weasel suit came from for Bobby Heenan. So that was something I did not realize, and that gave me a good chuckle.
Yes, and they actually did when they were talking about that gunshot story. They actually had some audio of Bobby Heenan telling the story as well. So yeah, they did focus on Bobby for a few minutes in the episode. So good stuff.
Absolutely.
All right, the Daily Wrestling News Show is on every day, Monday through Friday. It's a 5 to 10 minute quick episode that you can watch, or I shouldn't say watch, you can listen to on all of the various podcast players. You can go to dailywrestlingNewsShow.com/links to find links to all those areas where you can listen to it. John and I alternate on who hosts each morning's show. And what was today, John?
This morning was the birth of a new catchphrase, I believe.
Okay, there you go. Birth, and then it was a Vince McMahon spoken catchphrase as well. So
yes.
All right, that said, John, we'll see you next week.
Till then.